Great question. And, maximal muscle retention is the goal of every bodybuilder during prep. So I totally understand why you asked. And I think often when we think about muscle retention, we think about recovery. Like, what's the way I should train to make sure that I optimize recovery, that I'm ready to perform? And I think that's a good paradigm of thinking about it. And often the way to impact recovery is to manipulate frequency. Maybe you train less frequently, or maybe you do less volume per session, but you train more frequently. But ultimately, I think we need to stop thinking about contest prep as this totally unique animal, at least for the majority of it, in this circumstance. And we need to think more about how does muscle retention occur? And to know that, we have to talk about, well, how does muscle loss occur during a contest prep? And then we need to think about, okay, well, how does training impact those variables? All right, so we're going to unpack each of those. So first, how do we lose muscle? Why do we lose muscle? Well, the way we gain muscle is by training and eating sufficient calories and protein. You can actually, gain muscle even if you're not eating sufficient calories. And you can do, to a limited degree, a body recomposition. If that energy is available on your body as body fat and you're not too lean to where it suppresses the environment that allows you to do this, you can, start losing a little bit of fat and gaining a little bit of muscle. It's not the ideal environment. We do know from mechanistic studies on muscle protein synthesis that when you're eating in a surplus, things seem to work well. But when you're eating in a deficit, and we have a few studies that confirm this, muscle protein synthesis is blunted a little bit in response to eating and training. So the impact of your training sessions is a little less, and that can be offset to a certain degree by eating sufficient protein and training, but it does make it a little harder, okay? So the way we lose muscle from dieting is this suppressed muscle protein synthesis. And this is why when we look at studies on, say, people with obesity or people who are overweight who lose weight without resistance training, they're sometimes losing, say, 60-40 or 70-30 fat to lean mass. However, when you start giving people, these same people in other studies, a resistance training intervention, not only do many studies show that they were able to retain all their lean body mass, some of them actually seem to gain muscle mass in the process of dieting. So this kind of shows that concept that to some degree we need sufficient energy, and then also we need the protein to actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and we need the training, of course. Now, contest prep is a slightly different animal because not only do we get hit on the top end of this kind of muscle protein synthesis equation, where our muscle protein synthesis is capped, we're also actually seeing an increase in muscle protein breakdown once we get lean enough. So when we look at studies on the effects of an energy deficit in people who are lean rather than people who are high in body fat, this is exactly what's observed. We start to see an increase in muscle protein breakdown, which means we're using more of our dietary protein and more of our body proteins for energy, and we're seeing a blunted effect on muscle protein synthesis. And this is why typically muscle loss seems to anecdotally be observed more often in the later stages of prep. And this also happens at the same time as when you're feeling fatigued, you've been in a state of low energy availability, you've been dieting for months, and now you just don't have as much glycogen, you have suppressed sex hormones, you have suppressed adrenaline. Generally, you just feel very fatigued, tired, your sleep has been disrupted, you're not eating as much food, you're irritable, and you've gotten pretty beat up. And you're also probably doing more cardio than you normally have, which might be eating into your recovery capacities. So all these things happen at the same time, and they get exaggerated throughout prep. So this is where we're at, and that's why we seem to lose muscle as bodybuilders, at least in the late stages of prep, more often than we're able to gain it. Certainly that's quite rare, or maintain it. It's not impossible to maintain all your muscle during prep, or at least so much that you can't tell the visual difference, but it's certainly rarer than we'd like. So what do we do? Well, ultimately, this comes down to, well, how do I get the most out of my training? And how does training impact this whole process? Well, this comes down to, well, how do we gain muscle from training? And muscle gaining is a process that operates the same way, whether you're in a deficit or a surplus, okay? We don't have a special type of muscle retention training program. The way that we train to gain muscle, the same principles apply, because essentially what we're trying to do, if we kind of go back to that concept of muscle protein synthesis and breakdown, is we want to have that synthesis be greater than breakdown so that our balance is in a net positive. That's harder to do, obviously, with breakdown going up and synthesis coming down during a diet. But whatever maximizes muscle growth in the off season would theoretically maximize muscle growth, or muscle retention in this case, during prep. So you might be thinking, okay, well then I need to do a relatively high volume for me program, pushing it as hard as I can without underdoing recovery, and then I should be go. But the problem with that concept of trying to do as much as you can is that that's all based upon your ability to recover from it. So the amount of volume that's appropriate for you in the off season is going to change in the in season, even though there's a relationship between volume and muscle growth that is very individual. Someone like Jeff, for example, thrives on lower volume than I do, or Berto does. That's not to say that he's doing a low volume program. For him, he's doing an appropriate volume program. So whatever you found is an appropriate volume in the off season, you probably shouldn't be going higher than that during contest prep, because what's changed? You have less food, poorer sleep, you're leaner, less than ideal hormonal environment. Essentially, your ability to recover from the stress you're imposing is reduced. As Jeff would say, we're dealing with a different supply and demand environment. So we can't supply so much because demand is so high. So we're limited. So that means we need to do the most amount of work that we can during contest prep that we can recover from. And that, unfortunately, is going to be less as we get later and later and later into prep. Okay? Now, where does frequency come into this? And I know I've been building a long story for what seems like a simple question, but it's important to understand the fundamentals here. Frequency is essentially the way that you organize your training stress. Your frequency is going to be impacted by how much fatigue you've put upon yourself, and that is directly related to the proximity to failure that you're training and the total amount of work you're doing. So essentially, higher volumes and intensities necessitate lower frequencies. More moderate volumes and intensities, they allow you to have higher frequencies. This is why it's very challenging to have a high frequency, high volume, high intensity program, because you're not adequately allowing for recovery. You can typically have two of those or one of those, depending on your recovery capacities and how far you take it. So during contest prep, generally what needs to happen is not necessarily an adjustment in frequency, but eventually an adjustment in the total volume you're doing. Okay? So proximity to failure is probably going to be pretty similar, whether you're in the contest prep phase or the off-season phase. You're just trying to make sure that those sets are sufficiently effective. And generally, if you have a lower volume program, you need to go a little bit closer to failure to offset the fact that you're not doing as much work, and vice versa. If you find that you respond better to higher volumes, you can't be training to failure for every set, or the muscle damage is going to linger and prevent you from training with the frequency you need to accommodate that volume. So what I'd recommend is taking a look at the amount of volume you're doing in the off season, which you've seen through trial and error, seems to be what you respond best to. And then when you start contest prep, I'd probably keep things the same. No need to change anything. But as you get deeper and deeper into prep and your ability to recover is impeded, at this point you might want to start chipping away at the volume. Now, I think frequency in general should just be a factor of how much volume you're doing. If you have a very high volume program, it's really challenging to get it all done in one day. If you're trying to do 20 sets for your quads, probably shouldn't be doing 10 sets of squats, 5 sets of leg press, and 5 sets of leg extensions in the same day. You probably spread those out across the week. So therefore, if you're trying to do 20 sets per muscle group, you're probably training at least twice a week, if not 3 times a week for that muscle group. And that paradigm doesn't change as you get into contest prep. It's just that the total amount of volume you're doing might come down, but you might still have a similar frequency. Now, with that said, your mileage may vary. You might find that certain frequencies just seem to be a little too frequent for you, almost regardless of the amount of volume you do, if you train at a high enough intensity. Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum, where you really seem to get a boost from training less frequently, more frequently for each muscle group and doing less volume per session. So for example, when I do contest prep, I generally train 5 days a week, just like I do in the off season, and I will distribute my body part volume across those days, all of them. So some days I might be training, say, chest and back and triceps and quads. Another day I might be, say, glutes and hamstrings and shoulders or something like that. I wouldn't say that I train a full body on all 5 days, but I essentially look strategically at what's the way that I can reduce the amount of fatigue I'm experiencing in every single session. So some of the things I do during contest prep, it's not an adjustment in frequency or volume, but the distribution of the exercises. So for example, I find that deep into prep, doing a hip hinge and a squat pattern in the same day pretty much wrecks me, not only for the rest of the workout, but also just mentally and physically for the rest of the day. So if I need to get RDLs and squats and maybe a leg press in the week, I'm going to actually make sure those happen on different days. Well, if I was in the off season, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with doing, say, RDLs and leg press on one days, and then say, a squat and something else on another day. So it just comes down to what you can individually tolerate. And during contest prep, your frequency might stay the same, but you might distribute exercises differently across the week to make sure that no single day is truly a sink in your recovery capacities.